What's up? It's Cameron from Tinybird. In this screencast, I'm going to show you how to ingest data from a file into a Tinybird data source. I'm going to show you how to do this in two different ways. One, using the browser UI, and the second, using the Tinybird CLI. Let's jump in. Okay, for this demo, I'm using a remote CSV file in Google Storage. The file contains about 1 million rows of product data. And this is a CSV file, but Tinybird also supports NDJSON and Parquet files. .json file extensions are also fine, so long as the JSON objects are new line delimited. Now, the simplest way to create a data source from a file using Tinybird is with the browser UI. Just open up your workspace, click the plus icon next to data sources, or use the P hotkey, select remote URL from the menu, paste the file URL, confirm the file type, and click add. You now have a data source in Tinybird containing the data from that file. Behind the scenes, Tinybird analyzed the file, inferred the schema from some sample rows, created the table based on the inferred schema, and added the data. For this file, Tinybird inferred a string type for the SKU title and color columns, and an int16 type for the section ID column. Now, Tinybird does its best to guess the correct schema, but of course it can't gather all of the context from just some sample data. So you might want to tweak the schema before you start adding data to the data source. The CLI is a perfect tool to do that. One difference with the CLI is that it decouples those steps that happen behind the scenes when you upload using the UI. In the CLI, you can define the schema, create the table, and append data to it in separate steps. This may take a little bit longer, but it lets you get the schema just right before you add data to the data source. Now let's open up a shell and launch the CLI in a Python virtual environment. After you've authenticated and initialized your data project, type tb data source generate and then paste the file URL. This creates a .data source file with the inferred schema definition. Here's where you can edit the schema. So let's open up the .data source file in a text editor. This is a good place to point out that Tinybird offers an extension in VS Code that helps with creating and editing Tinybird data project files. Okay, so there are a few things about the data in this file that Tinybird couldn't infer that will inform some changes to the schema. The color column, for example, has a limited number of options, so the low cardinality type is probably appropriate here. And for the section ID, a uint8 will probably do, since there are only 50 different sections. So let's make those edits in the schema and save the file. You can also change the file name if you want. You can push that data source to the server with tb push and the .data source file path. Now, if you go back to the UI and refresh, you see the data source with the schema you defined. You can then add data to it from the CLI using tb data source append, the data source name, and that same remote file URL. And now you have the same data, but the data source is a little bit smaller since you optimized the column types in the schema. And there you have it, ingesting data from a file using both the UI and the CLI. But before I let you go, let me share two extra little tidbits about data sources. First, remember that you can share data sources across workspaces in the same cluster. So if a teammate wants your data, but you don't want them mucking around in your workspace, that's a nice little feature. Second, every Tinybird workspace has a service data source called data source ops log. This log keeps track of every event for every data source in the workspace, and you can query it with pipes and create endpoints from it, just like with any other data source in Tinybird. As always, if you have any questions, you can join us in Slack and ask away. See you next time.